I sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, staring down the very people I once called family. The silence in the room was deafening, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that comes right before a bomb drops. The air conditioner hummed softly, but the only thing I could actually hear was the steady, heavy beat of my own heart. My wife's funeral was practically yesterday, and the vultures were all at Corsi circling over my head. My daughter-in-law, Monica, leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished wood. She didn't look like a grieving relative. She looked like a predator that had finally backed an exhausted prey into a corner. She slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the table, the sharp impact echoing off the walls. Then she smiled, a cold, arrogant smirk. "Now that the old woman is finally out of the picture," she said, her voice dripping with poison, "you're going to sign the company over to my son and walk away. Your time here is done, Richard. It's our turn now." I looked over at my son, Derek, sitting right next to her. He kept his eyes glued to his expensive leather shoes, way too weak to even look his own father in the eye. They thought they had me completely trapped. They genuinely believed a 70-year-old man, broken by grief, was an easy target. But they completely forgot who built the empire they were trying to steal. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just smiled, crossed my hands, and waited. Exactly 3 seconds later, the heavy doors opened, and my attorney, Victor Long, stepped into the room. He didn't say a single word. He walked straight to the table and tossed a notarized DNA report right in front of Monica. "Before I tell you what was written on that paper and how I completely dismantled the people who tried to bury me alive, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to step up and teach ungrateful family members a lesson they'll never forget, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. To understand how we ended up in that room, you have to go back 3 days earlier. The faint, sweet smell of funeral lilies still hung in the air at my house. My Diane was gone. 45 years of a wonderful marriage, cut short in just a few brutal months by pancreatic cancer. The house was painfully quiet, that empty feeling leaving a dull ache in my chest. I stood alone at the kitchen sink, letting warm water run over my hands as I washed a single glass. It was just a mindless task to keep my hands busy, so my thoughts wouldn't drift back to the empty chair in the living room. The granite countertop felt cold under my hands. Diane had picked that granite out herself. She loved that kitchen. And now, someone who never showed her an ounce of real respect was standing on her floors, demanding the fruits of her lifetime of hard work. That's when I heard the sharp, rushed click of expensive high heels on the hardwood floor. I turned off the tap and dried my hands. Monica stepped into the kitchen. There wasn't a single tear in her eyes. Not a trace of sorrow on her heavily made-up face. Wearing a sharp black designer suit, she looked like she was heading into a hostile corporate takeover rather than mourning her mother-in-law. Without a single word of comfort, without even bothering to ask how I was holding up after the hardest week of my life, she slapped a thick manila folder down on the counter. The sound was loud and deliberate. I looked down at the folder. Printed in bold black letters, across the top of the cover page were the words, "Emergency Transfer and Succession Agreement." I looked up from the document, my eyes meeting Monica's. "What is this, Monica?" I asked, keeping my voice completely steady and calm. She let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh, acting as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "It's for your own good, Richard," she said smoothly, leaning against the counter. You're 70 years old. You just lost Diane. You're grieving, and you're in no condition to run Caldwell Logistics right now. You need to sign this today so we can transfer executive power to Chase. Chase was my 18-year-old grandson. Wal's my 18-year-old grandson, a boy who barely graduated high school and spent most of his time posting photos of his sports car on social media instead of looking at a balance sheet. I stared at the legal documents, feeling a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. To me, Caldwell Logistics wasn't just a company. It was the blood, sweat, and tears of my entire adult life. In 1985, Diane and I built this $15 million empire out of the back of a single, rusty delivery truck. We had no wealthy investors. We had $100 in our bank account and a shared dream. In our 20s, we ate cold sandwiches in freezing parking lots and slept in the narrow cab of that truck, fighting for every single client we got. Diane handled the books on a folding table while I drove through snowstorms to make deliveries. And now, just 3 days after I put the woman who helped me build all of it into the ground, my daughter-in-law wanted me to hand the keys to a teenager so she could pull the strings from behind the curtain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't show her my anger. In the business world, the moment you lose your temper, you lose the deal. I just looked at her and said, "The company is running just fine. I'm grieving, Monica. I'm not incapacitated." That was when my son, Derek, walked into the kitchen. He was 42 years old, but standing next to his overbearing wife, he looked like a terrified little boy waiting for orders. He stepped forward and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder, putting on a carefully rehearsed mask of deep concern. He was wearing a custom suit I bought him, living a comfortable life entirely funded by me. Yet here he was, trying to push me out to pasture before the dirt on his mother's grave was even dry. "Dad, please listen to her," Derek said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "Ever since Mom got sick, your blood pressure has been dangerously high. We're worried about you. We don't want to lose you too. Just sign the papers. Let Chase take the title in the family trust, and Monica and I will handle all the daily operations. You can finally rest and take care of yourself. You won't have to worry about a thing." It sounded so thoughtful, so caring. It was a perfect, reasonable lie. A loving son and a concerned daughter-in-law stepping up to take the heavy burden off an old man's shoulders. But I knew Derek better than anyone. I spent millions putting him through an elite Ivy League education, only to watch him turn into a weak man who couldn't make a single major decision without his wife's explicit permission. I looked down at the expensive gold pen Monica had deliberately placed right next to the folder. "I'll think about it," I said calmly, taking a step back from the counter. "I need some time to read through the legal terms before I sign anything." Derek nodded eagerly, visibly relieved that I hadn't flatly rejected them. "Of course, Dad. Take all the time you need," he said, forcing a warm smile. "Just don't wait too long. The market is volatile right now, and the company needs steady leadership." They turned and walked out of the kitchen together, their footsteps echoing down the long hallway, leaving me alone with the stack of papers. I stood frozen by the counter, my heart beating slow and heavy in my chest. I slowly turned my head toward the large bay window facing the hallway. The evening sky made the glass dark, turning it into a clear mirror. In the reflection, I saw Monica stop near the front door. She pulled her phone out of her designer purse and began typing furiously. She had no idea. I had a clear view of her reflection from where I stood. I watched her fingers fly across the screen. I didn't even need to guess what she was doing, because as she hit send, a bitter, triumphant smirk spread across her face. "The old man took the bait," she muttered to herself, slipping her phone away. "Get everything ready." I stood alone in the quiet, empty kitchen, warm water still slowly dripping from the faucet. They really thought I was a broken, clueless old widower who would just surrender. They thought they had outsmarted me in my own home. But they were about to learn a very hard lesson. An old wolf might lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth, and I was ready to bite back. The next morning, I woke up well before the sun even thought about rising. I hadn't slept much. The silence in the house without Diane was suffocating, and the heavy reality of my own family conspiring against me made the air feel thin. I needed the familiar hum of my empire to clear my head. I needed to stand in the halls of Caldwell Logistics and remember exactly who I was before those greedy kids wrote me off. At 6 in the morning, I pulled into the executive parking lot. The crisp morning air bit at my face as I walked toward the towering glass building. This place was my sanctuary. I had poured every ounce of my life into these walls. I crossed the quiet lobby, nodded to the overnight security guard, and took the private elevator straight up to the executive floor. I bypassed my office and walked straight toward the archives at the end of the hall. That room held backup records of every major financial transaction and trust document related to the company. If Monica and Derek were planning a takeover, they'd need to alter the foundational agreements. I walked up to the heavy security door and pulled my master keycard from my pocket. I swiped the plastic card against the electronic scanner, expecting the familiar green light and the click of the lock opening. Instead, the keypad let out a sharp, flat beep. A solid red light flashed back at me. Access denied. I stared at the glowing digital panel. My card was the master key. It was programmed to never expire, giving me unlimited access to every single room in the building. I swiped it a second time. Another beep. Red light. Access denied. I swiped a third time, pressing the card firmly against the sensor. Red light again. "Having trouble with your card, Richard?" The voice came from the shadows near the break room, sounding surprisingly loud in the quiet hallway. I slowly turned around. Stepping out into the dim morning light was Bradley Jenkins. Bradley was our chief financial officer. He was 45, wore tailored suits, and always wore way too much expensive cologne. The heavy scent of musk and cedar hit me like a wave, making my stomach turn. He walked toward me with a practiced, plastic smile on his face. For 6 in the morning, he looked entirely too awake and far too comfortable. "Bradley," I said, keeping my voice steady and measured. "My keycard seems to be malfunctioning. It's denying me access to the archives." Bradley stopped a few feet away, slipping his manicured hands into his pockets. "Oh, right," he said, his smile widening just a fraction. "I should have mentioned it. We're running a major system update on the security servers this weekend. Derek ordered a complete overhaul of our digital protocols to make sure our corporate data stays secure. The system is temporarily restricting access to sensitive areas while the tech team migrates the files." "Derek ordered it," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the empty hallway. Bradley nodded smoothly, completely unbothered. Yes, Derek felt it was best to handle the migration now. He mentioned you'd be taking an extended leave to mourn Diane, so he took the initiative to approve it. "Nothing to worry about, Richard. We have everything under control. You should go home and get some rest." I looked Bradley right in the eye. They were cold, calculating, and full of silent mockery. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew that I knew. They were locking me out of my own company, building a digital fortress to hide whatever financial games they were playing, with my son acting as the front man. The old Richard would have grabbed Bradley by his silk tie and marched him down to security. I would have demanded they cut the lock open right then and there. But the man standing here now was a seasoned veteran. If I made a scene, I'd be exposing my hand. I'd be giving them a reason to claim I was acting irrationally out of grief, giving Monica the exact ammunition she needed to prove I was mentally unfit to lead. "I won't argue with you, Bradley," I said smoothly, offering a polite nod. "I suppose a security update is long overdue. Tell Derek I appreciate his sudden interest in our data protection." I turned my back on the CFO and walked calmly toward my private office. I could feel his arrogant gaze burning into my back, but I didn't look back once. I stepped into my office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. I sat down in my leather chair. They thought turning off my keycard made me blind. They thought controlling the modern servers meant they controlled the flow of information. But they completely misunderstood how an old wolf protects his territory. I reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk. I pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner beneath the wood panel. A faint click echoed in the quiet room, and a secret compartment slid open, revealing a dusty, heavy external hard drive. I didn't need their network access. 10 years ago, as a safeguard against corporate espionage, I had a backdoor coded directly into the mainframe. This drive contained an offline mirror of every digital record Caldwell Logistics had ever generated. I connected the drive to my secure laptop. The screen flickered to life, prompting me for an encrypted password sequence only I knew. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. In just a few moments, I'd bypass their pathetic firewall and uncover whatever corruption Monica and Bradley were hiding in my books. I took a deep breath, ready to strike the first blow in this quiet war. But before my finger hit the enter key, the sharp ring of my personal phone shattered the silence. I started slightly, pulling my hand back from the keyboard. Very few people had this private number, and nobody should be calling it at 6:30 in the morning. I pulled the phone from my jacket pocket and looked at the screen. The caller ID showed the local county hospital. A cold feeling settled in my gut. Hospitals don't call at the break of dawn with good news. I answered the call and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is this Mr. Richard Caldwell?" a woman asked. Her tone was strictly professional, but there was an unmistakable urgency beneath it. "This is the emergency department at Memorial Hospital. I'm calling regarding your grandson, Chase Caldwell. He was involved in a severe motorcycle accident. He's currently in the trauma bay, and we need family here immediately." I slammed the laptop shut and shoved the encrypted drive back into the hidden compartment. The digital war over Caldwell Logistics would have to wait. My grandson was bleeding out, grabbing my car keys with a trembling hand. My heart hammering against my ribs, I rushed out of my office. I completely ignored the confused, annoyed look on Bradley Jenkins' face as I bolted past the break room, slamming my hand onto the elevator button. My mind raced with terrible images of Chase, lying broken on the cold asphalt. He was a reckless teenager, with too much money and too little sense. But he was still my family. He was the only heir Diane had doted on in her final years. The drive to Memorial Hospital was a terrifying blur of flashing traffic lights, blaring horns, and desperate maneuvers through morning traffic. I broke every speed limit in the city, gripping the cold leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white and my forearms ached from tension. I pressed the gas pedal all the way down, praying I wasn't too late. Leaving the car right in the emergency drop-off zone, without caring about parking tickets, I sprinted through the sliding glass doors. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the trauma ward stung my tired eyes, and the sharp smell of antiseptic mixed with stale waiting room. Coffee hung thick in the air. I spotted them immediately at the far end of the sterile corridor. Monica was pacing back and forth, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the polished floor. She was typing furiously on her smartphone, looking more inconvenienced than grief-stricken. Derek was slumped in an uncomfortable plastic chair, his head buried in his hands. His custom suit was heavily wrinkled, his broad shoulders trembling under the bright lights. I hurried down the hall, my heavy footsteps announcing my sudden arrival. Derek looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Dad," he choked out, standing up quickly and wiping his hands on his pants. "I got here as fast as I could," I said, grabbing his shaking shoulder. "What happened? How bad is it?" Derek swallowed hard, glancing nervously at Monica, who had finally stopped typing to look at me with mild impatience. "He took a turn too fast on that new sports bike," Derek explained, his voice shaking. "He lost control and slid right into a steel guardrail on the highway. Thank God he was wearing a helmet, so there's no severe head trauma or spinal injury. But he has a deep laceration on his left thigh, and there's some internal bleeding around his ribs. He lost a massive amount of blood before the paramedics arrived and got a tourniquet on him." Monica crossed her arms tightly, letting out a sharp, frustrated sigh that echoed down the hallway. "It's a complete disaster, Richard. We were supposed to finalize the trust transfer paperwork this afternoon, and now we're stuck in this miserable waiting room." I stared at her, completely appalled by her total lack of basic, maternal concern. Her teenage son was lying in a trauma bay, and all she cared about was the corporate handover schedule. Before I could call her out on her coldness, the heavy doors of the trauma bay swung open. A tired-looking attending physician walked out, wearing blue scrubs spotted with dark bloodstains. His surgical mask hung around his neck, revealing a face lined with exhaustion. "Family of Chase Caldwell," he called out, his voice echoing in the hall. We rushed forward, forming a tight, anxious circle around the doctor. "He's stable for the moment," the doctor said, holding a heavy clipboard. "We managed to stop the main bleeding in his upper leg, and his vitals are holding steady. However, his hemoglobin levels are dropping dangerously low. He needs a substantial blood transfusion immediately to prevent him from going into severe shock." Derek let out a heavy sigh of relief, leaning against the wall for support. "Then give him the blood," Monica demanded, waving a hand dismissively. "Get him hooked up and patched up so we can get out of here. We have a private recovery suite prepared for him at home." The doctor frowned, clearly annoyed by her demanding tone. "It's not that simple, ma'am," he said firmly. "Your son's blood type is very specific. He is AB positive. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be a massive logistical issue, but due to a major pileup on the interstate earlier, our blood bank is facing a severe shortage. We simply don't have enough AB positive or universal donor units on hand right now to safely complete the transfusion." He looked directly at Derek, then turned his gaze to Monica. "We need immediate family to donate. The boy needs blood, and he needs it running through his veins within the hour. We can take you both to the lab right now to cross-match and save his life." The world around me seemed to freeze instantly. The low hum of the hospital's ventilation system vanished. The rhythmic beep of a distant heart monitor went dead silent in my ringing ears. The doctor's words repeated over and over in my mind, like a broken record. AB positive. The boy was AB positive. My mind, trained for decades to analyze complex corporate data and spot contradictions, instantly locked onto a massive, undeniable biological impossibility. I am type O. My late beloved wife, Diane, was type O. According to the absolute laws of human genetics, two type O biological parents can only ever produce a type O child. That meant my biological son, Derek, was undeniably, factually type O. I knew this for a fact. I remembered his medical files from an emergency appendectomy when he was a kid. And Monica, as I recalled from a brief conversation years ago during a minor health scare, was type A. I stood completely still in that sterile hallway, staring blankly at the wall behind the doctor. Basic high school biology was screaming alarms in the back of my brain. A type O parent and a type A parent could naturally produce a type A child, or occasionally a type O child. But under no conceivable scientific circumstance could they ever produce an AB positive child. The dominant B allele had to come from somewhere. It had to come directly from a biological father who carried that trait. Derek didn't carry it. I didn't carry it. Diane didn't carry it. Right there in that bright hallway, only one terrifying, devastating truth remained. The teenage boy bleeding on that operating table. The boy I had doted on, spoiled, and groomed to inherit my $15 million empire, didn't have a single drop of Caldwell blood in his veins. Chase wasn't my grandson at all. I turned my heavy head slowly and looked at Monica. She was in a fierce argument with the exhausted doctor, loudly demanding that he contact another private hospital and fly the blood in via an emergency helicopter. It was a loud, aggressive performance, deliberately designed to draw attention away from the obvious, urgent need for her to donate her own blood. She knew she couldn't, not without exposing the truth. Then I shifted my cold gaze straight to my son. I expected to see a man confused by basic genetics, a worried, grieving father questioning the doctor about a catastrophic lab error. Instead, what I saw chilled me to the bone and shattered my heart into 1,000 sharp, jagged pieces. Derek was pressed tightly against the painted hospital wall, his knuckles white as he gripped the metal handrail. He wasn't looking at the frustrated doctor. He wasn't looking at his screaming wife. His eyes were glued to the linoleum floor, his entire body trembling under his expensive suit. Sweat rolled off his pale forehead in huge beads. He wasn't confused by the science. He was terrified. He knew, absolutely, undeniably knew, that the genetic math didn't add up. When he finally worked up the courage to lift his head, he felt my burning glare piercing right through him. For one brief, horrifying second, our eyes met in that sterile hallway. He saw the cold, sharp realization permanently locked onto my face. He could tell I had done the genetic math in my head and arrived at the truth. Derek instantly jerked his gaze away, completely unable to face the father he was actively helping to destroy. The heavy silence was finally broken when Monica pulled out her platinum credit card. She aggressively shoved it toward the exhausted attending physician, demanding he contact nearby private facilities and arrange emergency helicopter transport, regardless of the exorbitant cost. Realizing he was dealing with people who believed money could effortlessly bend reality, the doctor gave a brief nod and hurried back into the trauma bay to make the arrangements. With the immediate medical crisis temporarily diffused by Monica's aggressive financial intervention, A suffocating tension settled over the three of us. We were no longer just a family waiting for medical updates. We were a family standing on a foundation built of carefully constructed lies. A foundation that had just suffered a catastrophic structural fracture. I didn't confront them right there in the hallway. Cornering an animal in a wide-open public space was a major tactical error I had learned to avoid decades ago in ruthless business negotiations. Instead, I let the silence stretch for several agonizing minutes. Looking at Derek, who still stubbornly refused to meet my eyes, I calmly suggested, "We head down to the hospital cafeteria for coffee while we waited for the helicopter to arrive." He hesitated, his anxious eyes darting toward his wife for silent permission. Completely distracted by another text message on her phone, Monica gave an impatient wave, dismissing him. She clearly wanted space to handle her own business without my eyes on her. Derek swallowed hard, gave a weak nod, and obediently followed me to the elevator. The hospital cafeteria was a gloomy, depressing cavern buried in the basement of the building. The flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly yellow glow over the scattered plastic tables, and the air smelled heavily of burnt coffee and industrial bleach. We bought 2 cups of bitter, lukewarm coffee in thin styrofoam cups and found a secluded table in the farthest corner of the room. Derek sat across from me, gripping his cup with both hands as if that cheap plastic were his only anchor to the physical world. His broad shoulders slumped, his tailored suit jacket hanging loosely off his defeated frame. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the awful coffee, letting the bitterness coat my tongue. I set the cup down and looked right across the small table. "So," I said, keeping my voice flat, measured, and entirely free of accusation. That moment with the doctor was quite intense. I suppose it's a good thing Monica was willing to cover the emergency transport. But I have to admit, Derek, I'm a bit confused by the medical details. The doctor was very clear. Chase is AB positive. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the sticky plastic table. Diane and I are type O. You are type O. Monica is type A. How exactly does a boy with those biological parents end up with AB positive blood? Derek flinched violently, as if I had reached across the table and slapped him. The sweat that had dried on his forehead burst out anew in shiny, heavy beads. He squeezed his styrofoam cup so hard the hot coffee nearly spilled over the rim. He didn't look confused. He didn't express genuine shock over a potential lab mix-up. Instead, he exploded with immediate hostility. He slammed his cup onto the table, his voice cracking with high-pitched, desperate anger. "You're out of your mind with grief." "Dad," he snapped, his face turning bright red. "The lab made a simple typo on his chart. It happens all the time in chaotic emergency rooms. Don't start your paranoid interrogations today. My son is lying in a hospital bed, and you're trying to turn a simple clerical error into an absurd conspiracy." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full force of his outburst. In the cutthroat world of logistics and corporate takeovers, I had sat across from hundreds of desperate men trying to hide terrible truths. I knew what genuine confusion looked like. I knew what righteous indignation looked like. And I knew exactly what a cornered, guilty coward looked like when the walls of his lies started closing in. Derek wasn't stupid, but he was a terrible liar. He was hiding a massive secret, and his explosive, uncharacteristic aggression served only to confirm my worst fears. If he truly believed it was a simple lab error, he would have brushed off my question with an exhausted sigh. He would have gently reminded me that clerical mistakes happen. But he attacked me. He weaponized my fresh grief over losing Diane to deflect a completely logical biological question. As I stared at the sweating, defensive man sitting across from me, a deep, heavy sorrow washed over my soul. This was my son. This was the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for. Years ago, when Diane and I sat in the cramped cab of our first delivery truck, eating cold sandwiches, trying to build Caldwell Logistics from scratch, we dreamed of giving this boy a bright future. We poured millions of dollars into his privileged upbringing. We paid for elite private schools, lavish summer vacations, and an Ivy League education. We gave him every single advantage we never had, hoping to forge a strong, capable leader who could carry our empire into the next generation. Instead, all that money and privilege had produced an extraordinarily weak follower. Derek hadn't returned from college as a conqueror. He returned as a man devoid of a moral compass. He was someone who chose the path of least resistance, always bowing to the strongest personality in the room. Unfortunately for both of us, the strongest personality he ever encountered was his manipulative, socially ambitious wife, Monica. She quickly realized how easily he could be swayed, spending the last 2 decades molding him into an obedient, silent accomplice to fulfill her own greedy ambitions. He wasn't a partner in his marriage. He was a hostage who had slowly fallen in love with his captor. I let the tense silence stretch between us, refusing to break eye contact, refusing to give him an easy exit. "You're probably right, Derek," I finally said, my voice dropping to a soft, chilling whisper. It must have just been a typo. After all, what other possible explanation could there be? My words were carefully chosen, layered with unmistakable threat. Derek swallowed hard, the muscles in his neck twitching violently against his collar. He quickly looked away, completely unable to bear the weight of my gaze. He mumbled a weak agreement, staring blankly into the brown liquid swirling in his cup. He knew that I knew, and he knew he was completely powerless to stop the storm gathering on the horizon. I cleared my throat, slowly stood up from the cheap plastic chair, and left the untouched coffee on the table. "Take a moment to pull yourself together, son," I said, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, unhurried movements. "I'm heading back upstairs to see about the emergency delivery." I walked away without waiting for his answer, leaving him alone in that suffocating basement room, drowning in his own overwhelming guilt. I took the slow, clanking elevator back up to the trauma ward. My mind rehearsed 1,000 different scenarios, calculating variables and mapping out legal and financial countermeasures. When the doors slid open, I stepped out into the quiet hallway. I didn't walk straight back to the waiting area. Instead, I stopped behind a thick concrete pillar near the nurse's station, keeping myself hidden in the shadows. Farther down the sterile corridor, standing by a large glass window overlooking the bustling city below, was Monica. She was pacing furiously, whispering angrily into her smartphone. This was no lab typo. Chase was definitely not a biological Caldwell. I desperately needed undeniable proof, and I knew exactly how to get it. Shortly after Monica's frantic phone calls, the emergency helicopter arrived, and the blood transfusion was a success. Chase stabilized quickly, and within hours, the attending doctor declared him out of danger. By late afternoon, they discharged him with crutches, painkillers, and strict orders for bed rest. I played the role of the relieved grandfather perfectly. I hugged Derek, offered Monica a supportive smile, and told them I'd come by to check on them later. Then I went home to prepare my next move. I needed bulletproof evidence, and I needed to get my hands on it before they realized I had seen right through their deception. I picked up 2 large containers of chicken noodle soup, transferring them into my own glass containers to make them look homemade. I slipped a pair of latex gloves and 3 sterile plastic bags into the pocket of my wool coat. The sun had set by the time I pulled into their driveway. It was an estate with manicured lawns and a stone facade, paid for entirely with my money. I had written the check for the down payment 3 years ago to provide a stable environment for the boy I mistakenly believed was my own blood. Now, looking up at those lit windows, I felt a deep sense of violation. I walked up the stone steps and rang the heavy brass doorbell. Derek opened the door, looking exhausted and still wearing the crumpled suit from the hospital. "Dad," he said, his voice laced with surprise and a hint of anxiety. "You really didn't need to come over tonight. You should be resting." I held up the glass containers with a warm smile. "I couldn't sleep, son," I said softly. "I know you two must be exhausted. I brought some hot soup so you don't have to worry about dinner." Derek stepped aside, letting me into the grand foyer. The house was quiet, the thick carpet absorbing the sound of my heavy footsteps. We walked into the kitchen, where Monica sat at the marble island, a glass of red wine in one hand and a stack of discharge papers in the other. She didn't stand up to greet me. Instead, she immediately began complaining loudly about the exorbitant cost of the emergency transport she had demanded hours earlier. "Can you believe the nerve of these private transport companies?" she scoffed, tossing a bill onto the counter. "Charging us astronomical fees for a 20-minute flight. It's highway robbery." I set the soup down, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "Health and safety are priceless, Monica," I replied smoothly. "We're just thankful Chase is upstairs, resting comfortably." She rolled her eyes and took another sip of wine, completely missing the hidden double meaning in my words. When Derek offered to heat the soup and walk toward the stove, I seized my opportunity. "I'm going to wash my hands and check on the boy," I said casually, turning away before either of them could object. I walked up the stairs, my heart beating with cold, precise rhythm. The second floor was dimly lit and silent. I passed the master bedroom and walked straight to Chase's private suite at the end of the long hallway. I pushed his door open, just a crack. He was fast asleep in his large bed, his injured leg propped up on a pile of soft pillows, wearing a pair of noise-canceling headphones. I quietly pulled the door shut and slipped directly into his ensuite bathroom. The air smelled of expensive cologne and minty toothpaste. Reaching into my coat pocket, I pulled out the sterile plastic bags and the latex surgical gloves. I slipped the gloves onto my hands, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man focused entirely on his mission. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet above the ceramic sink. There, resting in a sleek holder, was his electric toothbrush. The bristles were still slightly damp from recent use. It was a pristine, uncontaminated source of genetic material. Careful not to touch the brush head, I pulled it out and dropped it directly into the first sterile plastic bag. I sealed the zipper, locked the evidence deep in my pocket, and shut the medicine cabinet without making a sound. Half the battle was won. Now, I needed a sample from Derek. I peeled off the latex gloves, slipped out of the bathroom, and glided silently back down the carpeted hallway. Instead of returning straight to the kitchen, I ducked into the large laundry room near the garage. Derek was a creature of absolute habit. He went to a high-end gym 3 times a week and always dumped his sweaty workout gear in a specific wicker basket by the garage door, too lazy to even throw it into the washing machine himself. I stepped into the dark utility room, scanning the neatly arranged shelves. I found the wicker basket immediately. Resting, right in at the top of the pile, was his dark gray zip-up jacket. The exact one he had tossed there yesterday afternoon, before the medical emergency disrupted their entire week. Slipping on a fresh pair of surgical gloves, I picked up the dark fabric and held it up to the dim safety light coming through the garage window. I carefully inspected the collar and inner lining. It took me less than 30 seconds to find what I was looking for. Entangled in the sweat-stained fabric near the high neckline were two distinct strands of dark brown hair. Pulling a pair of small metal tweezers from my pocket, I gripped the tips of the hairs and carefully extracted them from the lining. Holding them up to the light, I confirmed the tiny white hair follicles at the roots were completely intact. It was more than enough biological material for a definitive match. I dropped the hairs into the second sterile plastic bag, sealed it tightly, and secured it right next to the toothbrush in my coat pocket. I took off the gloves, smoothed out my coat, and walked back into the spacious kitchen as if nothing had happened. Derek was pouring the hot soup into ceramic bowls. I offered a warm smile, playing the role of a tired, relieved grandfather for 10 more minutes before gracefully making my excuses, claiming the long, emotional day had finally caught up with my aging body. They watched me walk out the front door, completely unaware that I was leaving with the very evidence that would burn their carefully constructed world to the ground. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove out of their pristine suburban neighborhood. But I didn't head back to my empty house. I pulled onto the dark highway, stepping on the gas and driving through the night to a private genetics lab 2 towns over. On the way, I dialed their priority line to arrange a confidential after-hours intake. I arrived at the sleek, unmarked medical building just after 2 in the morning. A stern-faced lab technician in a white coat let me through the heavy glass security door. I handed him the 2 sealed plastic bags, along with a thick envelope containing $5,000 in untraceable cash, demanding a priority analysis. Moti. The young technician carefully counted the cash, affixed random digital barcodes to the plastic bags to ensure complete anonymity, and assured me I would have definitive, legally binding results within 48 hours. When I stepped back out of the private clinic, the purple hues of dawn were just breaking over the eastern horizon. The biting morning cold whipped across my face, but I felt a strange, burning warmth deep in my chest. The biological evidence was secured. The hammer of science was officially in motion. I opened my car door, slid into the cold leather driver's seat, and let out a long, heavy breath. As I reached into my pocket for my keys, my fingers brushed against my smartphone. The screen burst to life, illuminating the dark interior as it vibrated violently in my palm. It was an automated security alert, triggered directly from the secret digital backdoor I had coded into the Caldwell logistics servers a decade ago. I stared at the glowing text, feeling the blood freeze in my veins. Someone inside the company was attempting to authorize a massive, unapproved wire transfer of $4.5 million. And they were desperately trying to use my personal digital signature to execute it. I threw the car into gear and sped out of the clinic parking lot. The sun was fully up now, painting the morning sky in vibrant oranges and golds. But my world had never felt colder. My mind was racing faster than the car engine. Whoever was sitting at that computer terminal trying to force that massive wire transfer through the system was getting desperate. They were trying to bypass primary authentication protocols by using a forged version of my digital footprint. I didn't drive back to corporate, confronting Bradley, or whoever was sitting at that desk would only give them a chance to wipe the servers and destroy the digital evidence before I could secure it. I drove straight back to my house, the massive, empty house that felt far more like a tomb than a home. I bypassed the kitchen and walked down the long hallway to my private home office. Locking the heavy door behind me, I closed the thick wooden shutters, plunging the room into shadow. I switched on the desk lamp and sat down at my secure terminal. A decade ago, when Caldwell Logistics was expanding rapidly and we were fending off aggressive corporate espionage, I had hired a brilliant independent programmer to build a fail-safe system into our network architecture. It was a digital ghost, a completely invisible back door coded directly into the foundation of the corporate servers. I had never told Diane about it, and I certainly never told Derek or the board of directors. It was my ultimate insurance policy against a catastrophic scenario, just like this. I booted up the terminal and entered a complex sequence of commands I hadn't used in 10 years. The screen flickered black, and then a waterfall of green code rushed across the monitor. I was in, moving through the invisible pathways of the network. I bypassed the heavily hyped corporate firewalls without triggering a single alarm. I locked onto the active terminal that had triggered the security breach. It was registered under the Executive Finance Suite. Bradley Jenkins was up early and hard at work, frantically trying to force a heavily encrypted wire transfer through the system using a spoofed credential package that mimicked my authorization. I watched his keystrokes in real time, like a ghost watching a burglar try to pick a lock. Bradley was a smooth, calculating accountant, but his understanding of deep network architecture was arrogant and fundamentally flawed. He had built internal locks to blind the general accounting staff and block my standard administrative access. But his walls were built on the surface. He had no idea I was moving beneath the foundations of his digital fortress. With a few precise keystrokes, I isolated his transfer request. Incessantly, silently quarantining the transaction and holding the $4.5 million in a hidden digital limbo where he could neither complete the transfer nor erase his attempt. I had trapped him completely. As I prepared to dig deeper into the system, my heart beat with a rhythm of cold, intense focus. I needed to see how long this rot had been spreading through my company, and I needed to gather every single piece of undeniable evidence before they realized they had been caught. Having stopped the immediate financial bleeding, I turned my attention to the source of the corruption. I needed to see just how deep this infection went. I traced the destination of that intercepted wire transfer, following complex routing numbers through a dizzying maze of offshore protocols and dummy corporate entities. What I uncovered was a meticulously planned, highly organized web of financial fraud. Bradley hadn't just been skimming off the top. He had engineered a massive pipeline designed to drain the very lifeblood of my company. I discovered 4 distinct shell companies, all recently registered in Delaware under bogus LLCs. They had completely unremarkable, generic names that blended perfectly into standard corporate expense reports. Global Freight Solutions, Apex Logistics Consulting, Horizon Management Partners, and Pinnacle Supply Chain Alliance. I pulled up the accounting ledgers connected to these ghost companies. The paper trail revealed a sickening series of fabricated invoices for fictional consulting services non-existent software upgrades, and fake logistics routes. The sheer volume of fake invoices was staggering, but they were carefully calculated to slide just beneath secondary board review that triggered an automatic secondary board review. Bradley had painstakingly orchestrated the payments to look like standard operational expenses, burying the theft behind a wall of tedious corporate bureaucracy. I began downloading every ledger, every fake invoice, and every routing number onto my secure hard drive, ensuring I had a permanent, unalterable record of their massive criminal enterprise. The depth of the deception was stomach-churning, revealing a level of calculated greed that shattered any remaining illusions I had about the people operating inside my own company. I dug deeper, matching the dates of the fake invoices to the corresponding outflows of corporate court funds. I pulled up the company's general ledger, cross-referencing the missing funds against our internal accounts. When the numbers finally aligned on my glowing screen, a wave of intense nausea hit me so hard I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. The money wasn't coming from our operational revenue, nor was it coming from our expansion reserves. The $4.5 million Bradley and Monica had systematically siphoned off over the last 8 months had been drained directly from the employee pension fund. They were stealing the retirement savings of the truck drivers, warehouse managers, and logistics coordinators, who had dedicated their lives to building this company alongside me. But the absolute worst part was the timeline. I stared at the dates of the largest outgoing wire transfers, feeling a sharp, twisting pain in my chest. The very first major withdrawal had been initiated 8 months ago. The exact same week Diane received her terminal cancer diagnosis. While I was holding my dying wife's fragile hand in sterile oncology waiting rooms, crying by her bedside, my daughter-in-law and my CFO were busy looting the company vault. They knew I was completely distracted by grief and medical decisions. They knew my focus was entirely on the woman I loved more than life itself. They had weaponized my agony, using Diane's tragic decline as a convenient, prolonged distraction to execute their theft. Every single time Monica visited the hospice center, she was calculating how much more she could steal. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, illuminated only by the glow of the monitor. The pieces of the puzzle finally slammed together with terrifying clarity. The massive embezzlement from the pension fund, the fake shell companies in Delaware, the desperate, panicked attempt at dawn to force a wire transfer through using a forged digital signature, and the sudden, aggressive demand for me to sign succession documents just days after Diane's funeral. Reaching into my briefcase, I pulled out the thick manila folder Monica had slammed onto my kitchen counter the day before. The emergency transfer and succession agreement. I flipped past the first few pages of legal jargon regarding executive power, skipping straight to the final clauses buried at the very back. There it was, hidden beneath layers of obscure corporate terminology. A sweeping indemnity clause that fully released the incoming executive director from any liability regarding prior financial discrepancies, alongside a mandatory authorization for an upcoming year-end audit bearing my signature as the sole approving authority. The transfer document was never about Simple's power grab. It was never about Monica wanting to rule the company from behind the scenes. That document was a meticulously crafted legal shield. The corporate year-end audit was scheduled to begin in less than 3 weeks. Independent auditors would comb through the company books, and it would take them less than an hour to discover a massive $4.5 million crater in the employee pension fund. When federal investigators inevitably arrived to comb through the wreckage, they would demand answers. They would look at the digital authorization logs and see forged credentials bearing my digital signature. If I signed that transfer document, I would be legally certifying all financial operations prior to the transfer of power. Monica and Bradley weren't just stealing my money. They were orchestrating a masterclass in framing me for the entire operation. They intended to pin the massive embezzlement squarely on my shoulders using my own signature. They needed my signature to seal my coffin, and they were more than willing to exploit my grief to get it. They had severely underestimated the man they were trying to destroy. The hours following my discovery in the digital shadows dragged on with a suffocating slowness. I had neutralized Bradley Jenkins, halting his panicked attempt to transfer the $4.5 million and freezing the stolen pension funds in mid-air. But that was merely the financial battlefield. The biological war was still being waged in silence, waiting for science to deliver its irrefutable verdict. I stayed locked in my dimly lit home office for 2 days, ignoring repeated phone calls from my son, Derek, who was growing increasingly anxious over my delay in signing the succession agreement. I ignored text messages from Monica, demanding a clear answer, wondering why her perfectly laid trap hadn't snapped shut. I needed absolute silence. Reacting now, without every single piece of the puzzle locked firmly in place, would be a fatal tactical error. I drank bitter black coffee and stared at the wall, compartmentalizing the betrayal into manageable, actionable pieces. Finally, on the third morning, the secure burner phone resting on my desk vibrated violently. It was a local number, the private genetics lab I had visited under the cover of darkness. I answered immediately, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Mr. Caldwell." A cold, professional voice spoke through the speaker. "We have completed the priority analysis on the biological samples you provided. The comprehensive results have been compiled, verified, and sealed. They are ready for you to pick up in person at the front desk." I didn't ask for the results over the phone. I needed the physical document in my hands. Thanking the technician, I hung up and grabbed my heavy wool coat. The final nail for my family's coffin was waiting for me. The drive to the clinic felt entirely different in the harsh morning sunlight. When I had driven this exact route 3 nights ago, I was a man driven by desperation and wild suspicion. Navigating the busy suburban streets, watching normal people go about their mundane routines. I was a man marching toward an inevitable execution. I parked in the sleek, unmarked lot of the medical building and stepped out into the crisp autumn wind. The clinical white walls of the lobby offered no comfort. I walked up to the reception desk and provided the anonymous digital barcode the technician had assigned to my plastic bags. The receptionist, a young woman looking far too cheerful for a place that routinely delivered life-shattering news, checked her terminal and retrieved a thick, tamper-evident manila envelope from a locked cabinet. She slid it across the counter, completely unaware of the absolute destruction sealed inside those paper walls. I took the envelope, feeling its heavy physical weight in my hands. I didn't open it in the lobby. I needed the absolute privacy of my own space. Walking back out through the sliding glass doors, the hum of the automatic mechanism sounded unnaturally loud in my ears. I climbed into the driver's seat, shutting the heavy door and locking it. I started the engine, letting the deep, rhythmic rumble of the motor fill the cabin. The heater blew warm air onto my cold hands, but it did nothing to thaw the ice that had settled around my heart. I sat in the idling truck for a long time, staring at the blank surface of the envelope resting on the passenger seat. Inside that paper shell was the absolute scientific truth of my lineage. For 18 years I had looked at Chase, trying to find traces of my own features in his face, searching his expressions for Diane's bright smile, looking for my own relentless drive in his actions. Now, I was about to find out if I had been searching for ghosts all along. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I reached over and picked up the envelope. I slid my index finger under the sealed flap, tearing it open in one swift movement, and pulled out the crisp, white lab report. The document was dense with complex genetic markers, DNA sequencing charts, and technical medical jargon, but I skipped past the data, my eyes landing directly on the bold, capitalized conclusion printed clearly at the bottom of the final page. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. The biological sample provided for Subject A shares no paternal genetic relationship with the sample provided for Subject B. The subject known as Chase is excluded as the biological offspring of the subject known as Derek. I read the numbers again, 0.00%. No margin for error, no statistical anomaly. A complete, undeniable biological zero. The teenage boy I had loved, spoiled, and prepared to inherit my $15 million empire was an absolute stranger. He didn't carry a single drop of Caldwell blood. Diane's sacred bloodline, the legacy we had worked so hard to preserve, had died the very moment my wife drew her last breath in that hospice bed. For a solid minute, a heavy, suffocating sadness washed over me. I mourned the loss of the grandson I thought I had. I mourned the absolute deception that stripped away my true legacy. And I grieved for Diane, thanking whatever higher power exists that she passed away before being forced to witness this stomach-churning betrayal. But the grief didn't last. It was wiped out almost instantly, burned away by a cold, calculating, and terrifying clarity. The kind that hits a man who just realized he's surrounded by ruthless predators. The sorrow vanished completely. I folded the lab report neatly in half and slid it safely into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. My mind, trained by decades of brutal corporate warfare, immediately started processing the new variables on the battlefield. If Derek wasn't the boy's biological father, then who was? Monica was a calculating, ambitious woman. She wasn't the type to risk her extraordinarily comfortable, heavily subsidized lifestyle over a random, meaningless affair with a stranger. If she was going to commit an act of infidelity that could destroy her lucrative marriage to the heir of a logistics empire, she would pick someone useful, someone who could actively help her reach her ultimate goal of absolute financial control. She would partner with someone who knew exactly how to manipulate massive sums of money without triggering corporate red flags. She would partner with someone who had deep, unrestricted access to Caldwell Logistics' complex financial setup. The realization hit me like a speeding freight train. The missing $4.5 million from the employee pension fund, the fake shell companies registered in Delaware, the desperate, panicked attempt at dawn to force a massive wire transfer through using a forged digital signature. Monica was never orchestrating this massive corporate embezzlement alone. She had a highly skilled, deeply entrenched insider working right beside her. I backed my truck out of the clinic parking lot, my destination firmly set. I wasn't going back to the office, and I wasn't going home. I was going to war, and I needed a soldier to gather my ammunition. I drove to an unassuming office building in an industrial zone on the edge of the city. Walking through the front door, I stepped into the minimalist, strictly functional office of Robert Sanchez. Robert was a former federal agent who had spent 20 years hunting down white-collar criminals and dismantling organized crime syndicates before transitioning into high-stakes, strictly confidential private investigation work. When properly compensated, he was ruthless, unbelievably efficient, and entirely without moral hesitation. I sat down in the uncomfortable chair across from his metal desk. Skipping the small talk, I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my checkbook, and signed a blank check. I slid the fresh piece of paper across the desk, leaving the financial amount completely empty. Robert looked down at the blank check, his dark eyes narrowing with intense professional curiosity. "I need you to dig up every single shadow Monica has ever cast, everything before and after she managed to marry my son," I commanded, my voice as cold and unforgiving as cracked ice. "Leave no stone unturned. I want to know where she spends her afternoons, what she buys, and exactly who she meets when she thinks nobody is watching. I want her entire life taken apart and laid bare on my desk." Robert slowly picked up the blank check, a slow, knowing smile spread across his weathered face. He asked, "Where would you like me to start?" "Mr. Caldwell," he asked softly. I leaned forward, cold fury burning in my chest. "Start with Bradley Jenkins." For the next 3 days, I moved through my own life like a ghost. I went to the office, attended meetings, and reviewed quarterly projections, as if the ground beneath my feet hadn't completely collapsed. When we passed each other in the hallway, I offered Bradley Jenkins a polite nod and the same professional smile I had given him for years. I took Derek's increasingly anxious phone calls regarding the succession paperwork, reassuring him in a tired, defeated tone that I just needed a little more time to get my affairs in order. Every word out of my mouth was a carefully calculated performance. I was a man standing in the middle of a burning room, calmly adjusting his tie while quietly locking every exit from the inside. They thought they were looking at a powerful man, rendered harmless by the overwhelming grief of losing his wife. They had no idea they were looking at a predator patiently setting up his slaughterhouse. On the evening of the third day, my burner phone finally vibrated. It was a text from Robert Sanchez with an address for a 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial district, and a specific time. I arrived 15 minutes early, pulling my truck into the dimly lit, potholed parking lot. The diner was a relic from another era, smelling heavily of old fryer grease and cheap black coffee. Robert was already sitting in a sticky vinyl booth, tucked away in the back corner, completely hidden from the large front windows. He was slowly sipping a cup of black coffee, his face an unreadable mask of professional stoicism. As I slid into the booth across from him, he skipped the greetings. Reaching into his worn leather briefcase, he pulled out a heavy manila folder and slid it across the scratched tabletop until it bumped softly against my crossed hands. "You were dead right to start with Bradley Jenkins, Mr. Caldwell," Robert said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, nearly drowned out by the faint hum of the diner's old refrigerator. "They weren't particularly careful. Arrogance usually leads to sloppiness." I stared down at the thick file, my fingers resting lightly on the rough paper, feeling the heavy weight of the secrets locked inside. I flipped open the cover. The very first page held a high-definition photo dated just 3 weeks prior, showing Monica and Bradley sitting close together in a secluded corner of an upscale restaurant outside the city. Bradley was leaning in, his hand resting intimately over hers, their faces inches apart in close, animated conversation. This was no business meeting. It was the undeniable body language of two people with a deep, familiar, and extremely secret past. They didn't meet 5 years ago, during a corporate restructuring event at Caldwell Logistics, like they've always claimed. Robert explained, tapping a thick stack of printouts behind the photos. I pulled their university records. They met 20 years ago at an out-of-state business school. They were college sweethearts living together in a rented apartment for 2 full years before graduation. When they realized neither had the family wealth to support their expensive ambitions, they made a strategic decision to branch out for greener pastures. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning hotel receipts, credit card statements, and private flight manifests that painted a clear, undeniable picture of a continuous, highly coordinated 19-year affair. They had maintained their romantic and financial partnership the entire time Monica was working her way into Derek's life, and long after she secured her place in the Caldwell family. "And the boy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, even though I already knew the answer. Robert gave a slow, somber nod. I discreetly obtained a biological sample from Bradley Jenkins yesterday morning and ran an expedited genetic comparison against the data you provided. Bradley Jenkins is undeniably Chase's biological father. Monica was already carrying his child before she ever walked down the aisle with your son. Mr. Caldwell, they essentially planted a cuckoo in your nest to guarantee a permanent biological link to your family's vast fortune. The truth hit me with sickening clarity. This was an extraordinarily long game. A 19-year strategic infiltration designed to slowly drain the lifeblood of my empire. Monica had used my weak-willed son to gain entry into the Caldwell wealth, and she used her biological child with Bradley to secure a permanent, unbreakable claim to the family legacy. They had manipulated my love, my pride, and my desperation for a grandson to cement their ultimate financial security. Yet, the absolute fatal blow was still buried deeper in Robert's meticulous investigation. Robert reached across the sticky table and pulled out a single sheet of paper-clipped to a second set of files. This was the hardest piece of the puzzle to extract, he said, his voice dropping even lower. I had to use some unconventional digital recovery methods to pull it from a deleted archive server, but I felt it was vital for you to see the complete picture. He slid the paper toward me. It was a printed copy of a private email, dated precisely 10 years ago, sent from a heavily encrypted personal account belonging to Derek, addressed directly to Monica's personal inbox. I looked down, my eyes scanning the text. The words burned themselves into my retinas, destroying the last remaining fragments of the family I thought I knew. I read the message, my heart turning to a cold, heavy stone. Monica, the email, read, "I got the specialist's test results today. It's confirmed. I'm completely infertile. The infection I had as a kid caused permanent, irreversible damage. There is zero chance I can ever father a child. We have to be extremely careful. If my mother finds out, if she realizes I can't provide a biological heir, she will trigger the lineage clause in the trust. She'll cut me off entirely and leave everything to charity. We have to maintain illusion. The illusion my father can never know. Chase is the only leverage keeping my inheritance safe." The diner surroundings faded away. The smell of grease, the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet muttering of the few other patrons, all dissolved into a buzzing, suffocating void. Derek knew. He had known for 10 years. He knew Chase wasn't his son. and he knew Monica had brought another man's child into our family. Instead of confronting the betrayal or coming to me with the truth, my son had actively chosen to become a co-conspirator in this massive, ongoing fraud. He played along with the lie purely out of a desperate, pathetic fear of losing his multi-million-dollar inheritance. Diane had always been fiercely protective of the Caldwell legacy. She insisted on including a strict, ironclad clause in our family trust, stating that the vast majority of our corporate assets and personal wealth could only ever transfer to direct biological descendants of the Caldwell bloodline. She wanted to ensure the empire we built out of a rusty truck would never fall into the hands of opportunistic outsiders or manipulative spouses. Derek knew about that clause. He knew his infertility meant he could never satisfy his mother's strict requirement to gain ultimate control of the trust. So, out of pure greed and a desperate, cowardly need to maintain his lavish lifestyle, he struck a sickening deal with Monica. He would raise another man's child, pretend to be a proud, loving father, and actively deceive his own parents, all to make sure he didn't lose his claim to that $15 million fortune. He had sold his mother's honor and his father's trust for a check. He wasn't a victim of Monica's grand deception. He was a willing, active participant in a 19-year fraud. He watched me dote on a child that wasn't mine. He watched me beam with pride at the boy I thought would carry my name into the future. And he did it all, while silently calculating how much money it would ultimately net him. I sat in the uncomfortable vinyl booth, staring at that printed email, until the letters blurred into a meaningless black smudge. The deep grief that had briefly touched me at the genetics clinic was completely gone now. In its place was a cold, absolute, and terrifying sense of purpose. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was no longer a disappointed father. I was a target marked for slaughter by the very people I had spent my entire life protecting and providing for. I carefully folded the email and placed it back into the thick file. Closing the cover, I pressed my hands firmly flat against the manila envelope and looked up at Robert Sanchez, who was watching me with silent professional respect. He sensed the shift in my demeanor. He saw that the predator had finally awakened and taken full control. "Thank you for your outstanding work, Robert," I said, my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of human warmth. "Your investigation provided exactly what I need to move forward." Robert gave a slow nod, picking up his cold coffee cup. "What is your next move, Mr. Caldwell?" he asked softly. I stood up from the sticky booth, tucking the heavy file firmly under my arm. "I'm going home, Robert," I said, buttoning my wool coat. "I'm going to invite my loving son and my devoted daughter-in-law into my study. I'm going to play the broken, defeated old man they so desperately want me to be. And I'm going to give them just enough rope to hang themselves." I drove back to my massive, empty house, the heavy file resting heavily on the passenger seat. The street lights flickered past, casting long, moving shadows across the leather interior of my truck. My mind worked like a steel trap, completely compartmentalizing the profound betrayal I had just uncovered. There would be plenty of time for anger later. There would be time to mourn the son I thought I had, and the grandson that was never mine. Right now, I needed absolute, unwavering focus. I needed to execute a convincing performance that would keep Monica and Derek completely blind to the executioner's axe hanging right over their heads. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching loudly under my heavy tires. The house was pitch black, exactly as I had left it. Walking inside, I went straight to my private study. I locked the file into the hidden biometric safe beneath my desk, placing the explosive truth right beside the encrypted drive containing the evidence of their massive corporate embezzlement. Picking up my secure burner phone, I dialed Derek's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with forced concern and barely concealed anxiety over my delay in responding to his demands. "Dad," he said, hurriedly, "are you all right? I've been trying to reach you for 2 days." I let out a long, raspy sigh, deliberately letting my voice carry a fragile tremble. I coughed weakly, leaning heavily against the solid mahogany desk. "I'm sorry, Derek," I murmured, making my voice sound thin and exhausted. "I'm just so tired. The grief, it's finally caught up with me. I feel like I'm drowning in it." I paused, letting the silence hang heavily on the line, ensuring he fully absorbed the image of a broken, defeated old man. "I think you and Monica should come over tonight. I've made my decision regarding the succession agreement." I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Of course, Dad," Derek replied, his tone smoothing out instantly into a practiced, soothing tone. "We'll be right over. You don't have to worry about a thing." Over the next hour, I carefully set the scene in my study. I dimmed the overhead lights, plunging the room into deep, gloomy shadows. I placed a framed photo of Diane prominently in the very center of my desk, angling it so her bright, smiling face would be the first thing anyone saw upon entering. Unbuttoning my collar, I mussed my gray hair to make it look unkempt, and deliberately slouched in my chair. I was a man who built a $15 million logistics empire on sheer willpower and ruthless negotiation. But tonight, I was going to play the role of a pathetic, crumbling widower who had finally buckled under the weight of his own sorrow. When the heavy brass doorbell finally rang, I didn't rush to answer it. Moving with a slow, deliberate, shuffling gait, I leaned heavily on the banister as I walked down the grand staircase. I pulled open the heavy oak door. Derek and Monica stood on the stone porch, both dressed in understated yet expensive clothes, wearing exaggerated, theatrical masks of sympathy. "Dad," Derek murmured softly, stepping inside and wrapping an arm around my shoulders in a brief, awkward hug. Monica followed closely behind, offering a tight, sympathetic smile that didn't hide the sharp, predatory gleam in her cold eyes. We walked back to my study. Sinking heavily into the large leather chair behind my desk, I let my shoulders drop completely, resting my hands flat on the desktop while letting my fingers tremble slightly. Derek and Monica took the 2 leather chairs facing me. I looked at the framed photo of Diane, letting a long, agonizing silence stretch between us. I forced a real tear to well up in my eyes, born from the genuine sorrow of losing my wife, and let it trail slowly down my weathered cheek. "You were right, Monica," I finally whispered, my voice appropriately raspy. "I can't do this anymore. Without Diane, this house is just a tomb. The company, the meetings, the relentless pressure, it's all too much." Looking up, I met her gaze with dull, defeated eyes. "I'm just so tired. I want to rest. I want to be left alone with my memories." Monica sat up straighter in her chair, greedy triumph practically radiating off her. She tried to maintain her mask of polite concern, but the muscles around her mouth twitched into a barely suppressed smirk. "Oh, Richard," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we completely understand. Grief is a terrible, heavy burden. You've worked so hard for so many years." It's time for you to step back and let us carry the load. You deserve peace. Derek nodded eagerly beside her, reaching across the desk to pat my trembling hand with fake warmth. We're here for you, Dad. We'll handle everything. You won't ever have to worry about Caldwell Logistics again. We'll protect the legacy you and Mom built. The sheer audacity of that complete lie, delivered while holding my hand, sent a shockwave of cold fury straight through my core. He was talking about protecting a legacy he had already sold off to the highest bidder. He was talking about honoring a mother whose dying days he used as cover to execute massive corporate theft. Swallowing the bile rising in my throat, I forced a slow, weak nod, maintaining the illusion of absolute surrender. Draw up the final papers, I instructed, letting my voice drop to a tired, defeated murmur. Have the lawyers finalize the emergency transfer. I'll sign everything over to Chase. I want him holding the title in the family trust, just like you asked. You and Derek can run the daily operations. I just want it done quickly. I want this burden off my shoulders before the weekend is over. Monica's eyes widened with unvarnished greed. The trap was snapping shut exactly as she had designed it. Leaning forward, eagerly, her manicured fingers gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. We'll have the papers ready for your signature before the board meeting on Friday morning, she promised, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. We can officially execute the transfer of power in front of the entire executive committee. It will be a smooth, seamless transition. Derek smiled, a flash of weak, cowardly relief washing over his pale face. Thank you, Dad. This is the right decision. We'll make you proud. I promise. I let them stay for another 20 minutes, enduring their fake sympathy and transparent attempts at comfort. They talked about the future of the company, discussing minor, operational changes they planned to implement, carefully avoiding any mention of the $4.5 million crater they had blown in the employee pension fund. They were so convinced of their own brilliance, so sure they had successfully manipulated a grieving old man, that they completely failed to notice the predatory stillness lurking beneath my fragile act. They thought they were watching a dying king surrender his crown. They had no idea they were watching an executioner prepare the scaffold. Finally, they stood up to leave, eager to finalize their treasonous legal documents. I walked them to the front door, maintaining my shuffling, defeated gait. Derek hugged me again, whispering empty promises of family support. Monica gave me a stiff, formal embrace, her mind clearly already focused on Friday's board meeting. I watched them walk down the stone steps and climb into their expensive luxury SUV, a vehicle paid for entirely with my hard-earned money. Standing on the porch, wrapped in the cold night wind, I watched the red taillights of their car vanish down the dark, winding street. The second their car disappeared from sight, the fragile, trembling old man vanished completely. I stood up straight, my shoulders pulling back, and my spine aligning like hardened, unyielding steel. The fake tremble in my hands disappeared, replaced by absolute, rock-solid stability. Walking back inside, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind me with a decisive thud. I marched down the hallway with firm, purposeful strides, the gloomy lighting no longer affecting me. Returning to my study, I flipped on the bright overhead lights and picked up my secure burner phone. Without hesitation, I dialed a number I had memorized decades ago. It rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. Victor Long. Victor was my personal corporate attorney. He was 55 years old, A brilliant, ruthless legal shark who had spent his career tearing competitor companies apart in brutal courtroom battles. He was a man who understood that real power was exercised not with smiles, but with an extraordinarily sharp legal scalpel. "Victor," I said, stripping my voice of all tired pretense, restoring the cold, commanding tone of the CEO who built Caldwell Logistics. "Clear your schedule for the rest of the week. I need you to draft a comprehensive dossier for termination and disinheritance. We are facing a massive systemic breach of fiduciary duty, multiple course of grand financial fraud, and a severe violation of the Diane Caldwell lineage clause." There was a brief, sharp intake of breath on the line. Victor didn't ask unnecessary questions. He recognized that tone. He knew exactly what it meant. There was, "Who are the targets, Richard?" he asked, his voice entirely flat, shifting instantly into a cold, tactical mindset. "My son, Derek," I answered, my voice steady as a rock. "My daughter-in-law, Monica, and Bradley Jenkins." I paused, letting those names settle heavily over the line. They are attempting a hostile takeover disguised as an emergency succession. And they are using my signature to cover up $4.5 million in stolen pension funds. They want to finalize the transfer at Friday morning's board meeting. Victor let out a low, dry chuckle, completely devoid of humor. "Then they are extraordinarily ambitious. What are your specific instructions?" I stared at the framed photo of Diane on my desk. Her smiling face seemed to urge me forward, demanding absolute justice for the legacy she helped build. "Prepare the financial audits, Victor. Co-coordinate with your federal contacts regarding the embezzlement and bring the absolute proof of the biological fraud." I brought the phone closer, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "We are going to let them sit comfortably at the head of the conference table on Friday morning. We are going to let them think they've won. And then, Victor, we are going to dismantle them entirely. It's time to start the execution." The next 48 hours were a masterclass in human arrogance. Believing they had successfully cleared the final hurdle, Monica and Bradley completely abandoned caution. Their arrogance became a blinding, intoxicating poison. Before the ink was even dry on the succession documents, they began systematically purging anyone inside Caldwell Logistics who might question their new authority. Leasing. By Wednesday afternoon, I received a frantic, confused phone call from Thomas Sterling. Thomas was my fiercely loyal vice president of operations, a man who had been by my side for 20 years. He told me Bradley had just walked into his office accompanied by company security, handing him a severance agreement under the guise of an immediate executive restructuring. Thomas wasn't the only casualty. In less than 24 hours, they also abruptly fired my longtime director of human resources and my chief logistics coordinator, replacing all three dedicated veterans with sycophantic, grossly underqualified cronies hand-picked by Bradley. These new hires were nothing more than obedient rubber stamps, explicitly recruited to turn a blind eye to financial discrepancies as the theft continued. And Derek, the supposed heir, did absolutely nothing to stop the brutal corporate purge. He simply hid in his immaculate corner office. Signing the termination authorizations, his wife slid across his desk, without asking a single question. I told Thomas to quietly accept the severance, pack his personal belongings without making a scene, and take a short, relaxing vacation. I assured him in an absolute, unquestionable tone that by Monday morning he would be sitting back in his rightful chair. He trusted me completely, walking out of the building with his head held high. On Thursday morning, I moved through the hallways of my own company like an invisible ghost, playing the tragic role of the departing, melancholic founder paying his final respects to his life's work. I walked slowly, my shoulders slouched, letting the employees see the broke man rumored in the break rooms. Around noon, I shuffled into my private corner office. The heavy wooden door was propped open, and two interior designers holding digital tape measures were actively taking room dimensions. Monica stood right in the center of the room, pointing at the dark mahogany paneling, demanding it be painted a stark, cold white. She was already measuring space for imported Italian furniture she planned to ship in, completely erasing the rich history embedded in those walls. I stood quietly in the doorway watching her wave dismissively at the solid oak desk positioned by the large bay window. That desk wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was where Diane and I sat, side by side 30 years ago, drinking cheap champagne out of paper cups after signing our very first $1 million freight contract. We had held each other and cried that night, realizing that our grueling struggle to build the company had finally secured a permanent future for our family. Monica looked over at me standing in the doorway, offering a brief, condescending smile. She told me not to worry, assuring me they would help pack my personal belongings into boxes later that evening. I simply nodded, thanking her for her thoughtfulness, and turned away. As I left my violated sanctuary, I felt no anger, only a deep, chilling anticipation. While Monica was busy selecting expensive fabric swatches for her stolen throne, Victor Long and I were operating in the deep, invisible currents of the corporate underworld. We had converted my home study into a highly secure, encrypted war room. Victor moved with the cold, terrifying efficiency of an apex predator sensing blood in the water. He used a secure, highly encrypted server to establish direct contact with Special Agent Harrison, a decorated veteran of the FBI's white-collar crime division. Harrison was an opponent Victor occasionally clashed with in court, but both held an uncompromising, mutual respect for undeniable, solid evidence. We handed over the digital keys to the invisible back door I had coded into the Caldwell Logistics servers, granting federal agents completely unrestricted access to this maze of financial corruption. They spent all of Wednesday night and Thursday tracing our carefully flagged digital breadcrumbs. In real time, they monitored Bradley and Monica, siphoning off the remainder of the employee pension fund through the 4 fake Delaware LLCs. They verified the forged digital signatures, mapped out the offshore routing protocols, and obtained search warrants to freeze the illicit accounts in the Cayman Islands. The trap was no longer just an internal corporate firing. It had transformed into a massive, fully coordinated federal sting operation. Agent Harrison personally assured Victor that heavily armed teams would be strategically deployed in unmarked vans surrounding the Caldwell Logistics building before dawn. The evidence for the $4.5 million embezzlement case was airtight, and the federal government was ready to claim its prize. Friday morning finally broke, washing the city in a cold, brilliant, unforgiving light. I stood in the middle of my master bedroom, listening to the absolute silence of the house. The time for playing a grieving, broken old man was officially over. That performance had served its purpose, lulling my enemies into a false, intoxicating sense of absolute security. I walked over to the spacious walk-in closet, passing right by the dark, conservative morning suits I had worn for the past week. Instead, I pulled out an impeccably tailored, charcoal gray suit with peak lapels. It was the armor of a corporate titan, the garment I reserved for times when I intended to completely crush my strongest business rivals. I dressed with slow, deliberate precision, buttoning my crisp white shirt, securing the heavy platinum cufflinks, and tying a dark red silk tie into a perfect Windsor knot. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The hunched, trembling widower was completely gone. Looking back at me was the founder of Caldwell Logistics, a man who had survived economic collapses, ruthless competitors, and the deep tragedy of losing his beloved wife. Walking over to the solid wooden nightstand stand, I saw where Diane used to keep her favorite pearl necklace. I touched the cool pearls, gently drawing strength from her eternal memory. My focus remained sharp, my purpose unwavering. I was not merely protecting my vast fortune. I was defending the sacred honor of the woman who sacrificed everything to build this grand empire by my side. Turning away from the quiet bedroom, I strode down the grand staircase, my footsteps echoing off the polished hardwood floors in a commanding rhythm. I walked into the dimly lit study, where, just a few short nights ago, Monica and Derek foolishly believed they had finally broken me. The atmosphere in the room felt entirely different now. The heavy shadows previously used to mask my carefully rehearsed weakness now seemed to embrace my impending retribution. Reaching into the hidden compartment of my heavy oak desk, I retrieved the thick, tamper-evident envelope containing the genetics lab report. That single document held the absolute scientific truth about Chase and his parentage. The ultimate weapon that would permanently sever their unearned claim to my empire. Carefully folding the document, I slipped it smoothly into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket, pressing it close to my chest. Strapping my heavy silver watch onto my wrist, I checked the time. It was 7 in the morning. The board meeting was scheduled to begin in exactly 2 hours. Federal agents were currently moving into position. Victor's briefcase was safely packed, with immediate termination legal notices. The intricate chessboard was set, and my arrogant adversaries were blindly marching their king directly into a lethal, inescapable trap. Stepping out the front door, the crisp morning wind filled my lungs with a sharp, exhilarating clarity. I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, gripped the thick leather steering wheel, and turned the ignition key. I intended to walk into that boardroom and let them sit comfortably at the head of the long mahogany table. I would let them look down on me, completely convinced they had finally won this brutal war. I'd allow them to savor a few brief minutes of glorious, pure triumph before burning their stolen world completely to ash, without a shred of mercy. Putting the truck into gear, I drove off my quiet suburban driveway as the rising sun reflected brightly off the windshield. Today was not a day for mourning. Today was a day of absolute reckoning. The villains had enjoyed their brief, reckless reign. Now, the true master was back. The drive to corporate headquarters blurred past in familiar streets and morning traffic. My mind was focused entirely on the execution ahead. I pulled into my reserved parking spot, stepped out into the biting morning air, and walked through the sliding glass doors of Caldwell Logistics. My posture was upright, the fabric of my custom suit fitting my shoulders with rigid authority. The security guards and receptionists, who had watched me shuffle around like a broken, defeated old man over the past 2 days, stared in shock. The fragile, trembling widower had completely vanished. I strode confidently toward the private executive elevator, my dress shoes clicking rhythmically on the polished marble floor. Every step was a calculated blow against the false reality my enemies had constructed. I pressed the button for the top floor, watching the numbers climb, taking me straight to the absolute climax of this ruthless corporate war. When I arrived, the heavy mahogany doors to the main boardroom were closed. I didn't knock. I pushed the doors open and walked straight into the spacious room. The room was packed. Monica, eager for her grand moment of victory, had orchestrated a dramatic spectacle. She sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, occupying the leather chair that had belonged to me for 30 years. To her right sat my son, Derek, looking extraordinarily pale and sweating under his expensive designer suit. To her left sat CFO Bradley Jenkins, wearing a smug, triumphant grin that made my stomach turn. Next to Bradley sat 18-year-old Chase, casually scrolling on his smartphone, entirely oblivious to the massive criminal conspiracies surrounding him. The rest of the long table was occupied by the sycophantic new executive hires. Bradley had rushed in to replace my loyal veterans. They looked at me with a mix of pity and arrogance, convinced they were about to witness the pathetic final surrender of a dying king. I slowly walked toward the only empty chair left at the far end of the massive table, never breaking eye contact with Monica. Sitting down, I placed my hands flat on the cool, polished wood. The room fell silent, the only sound being the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Monica leaned forward, lacing her manicured fingers together and resting her elbows on the table. She radiated pure, greedy triumph. Signaling to one of the new executives, the man hurriedly pushed a heavy manila folder down the table. It slid smoothly across the polished mahogany, coming to a gentle stop right in front of me. Placed directly on top of the legal documents was an expensive, heavy gold pen. This is the final emergency transfer and succession agreement. Monica unannounced, her voice echoing through the quiet room. Her tone was sharp and authoritative, stripped of the fake, sweet sympathy she had used in my study a few nights prior. The new board members in this room have fully approved the transfer of executive power. We've streamlined the legal process to ensure all corporate assets and operational authority transfer quickly and seamlessly into the family trust. The only thing we need now is your final authorizing signature on the dotted line. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. Buried deep within those pages were the indemnity clauses and mandatory audit authorization clauses designed to legally pin the $4.5 million pension theft squarely on me. Looking back up at Monica, I saw she was no longer pretending to be supportive family. She was a predator who believed her jaws were locked onto my throat. The mask was completely off. Leaning back in my chair, a cruel, mocking smile spread across her face. "Now that the old woman is finally out of the picture," Monica said, her voice dripping with pure poison and unvarnished malice, "you're going to sign the company over to my son and walk away. Your time here is done, Richard. It's our turn now." The sheer, brutal audacity of her statement hung heavy in the still air. She had finally spoken the absolute truth, exposing the darkest, rotten core of her decades of deception. The new executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, slightly unnerved by her blatant cruelty, yet remaining silent, out of loyalty to their corrupt employer. Bradley Jenkins chuckled softly, adjusting his silk tie with pure arrogance. Chase finally looked up from his smartphone, somewhat confused by the sudden tension, but quickly turned his attention back to his glowing screen. I didn't react to her malicious insult regarding my late wife. My face remained an impenetrable mask of cold stone. Slowly reaching out, I picked up the heavy gold pen resting on top of the folder. The polished metal felt cold and solid against my fingers. Holding it loosely, I let the morning light refract off the golden barrel. Turning my head, I looked directly at Derek. This was the absolute final threshold. He was a weak, cowardly man who had actively participated in a massive systemic fraud to protect an unearned inheritance. He had sat there and watched his wife insult the memory of his recently deceased mother. Yet he was still my son. I stared at his anxious, sweating face, offering one final, silent plea. I gave him a brief, single chance to be a man, to speak up and stop this madness before the federal hammer crushed his entire life. I waited, hovering the gold pen in the quiet air. Derek swallowed. Hard, his throat moving violently against his tight collar. He saw the intense, piercing question in my eyes, knowing exactly what I was asking of him. For a terrifying second, I saw a flash of genuine hesitation cross his pale face. But cowardice was rooted far too deep in his soul. The fear of losing his lavish lifestyle completely overwhelmed whatever fragments of basic human conscience remained. Derek made his choice. Looking away, he turned his head, staring blankly at his polished leather shoes. The betrayal was complete. I slowly unclasped my fingers, letting go of the gold pen. The metal cylinder dropped onto the mahogany tabletop with a sharp clatter that echoed loudly in the silent room. Leaning back comfortably in my chair, I folded my hands over my lap, staring directly into Monica's expectant, arrogant eyes. "No," I said calmly. Before her brain could process my absolute refusal, the heavy double doors to the boardroom were thrown open with brutal force. Victor Long strode in, flanked by two cold-faced federal agents in dark trench coats. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted to absolute zero. Victor Long didn't stop for pleasantries, nor did he introduce the towering federal agents stepping seamlessly into the room, their dark coats standing out against the luxury corporate environment. He moved with the precise, deliberate steps of a seasoned executioner, walking to the scaffold. The arrogant, triumphant smiles faded instantly from the faces of the newly appointed board members, replaced by a wave of heavy, suffocating confusion. Ignoring the row of empty chairs, Victor walked straight to the end of the long mahogany table, stopping just a few feet from where Monica sat in my executive chair. He unclasped his sleek black leather briefcase. The sharp, metallic snap shattered the dead silence in the room. Reaching inside, he pulled out the thick, tamper-evident envelope containing the verified genetics lab report. With a swift, practiced flick of his wrist, he tossed the crucial document right into the center of the polished table. It slid smoothly across the reflective surface, stopping right between Monica and Derek. The white document looked ordinary, but the massive truth it contained was about to violently explode their stolen reality. Buttoning his custom suit jacket, Victor's expression was an impenetrable mask of pure legal authority. Before anyone in the stunned room could catch their breath to ask a question, Victor spoke. His booming baritone voice instantly commanded absolute attention, leaving zero room for interruption. "I am acting on behalf of Richard Caldwell as legal representative in all matters regarding the execution of the Diane Caldwell Trust and the succession of Caldwell Logistics." "Hick," he announced loudly, staring directly at Monica. "The sealed document I have placed before you is a fully legally binding, independently verified genetic analysis. It was expedited and officially certified less than 48 hours ago by a top independent medical laboratory. Victor didn't wait for their trembling hands to reach out and open it. He recited the devastating conclusion entirely from memory, his articulation flawless and heavy with deliberate punishment. Based on the analysis of the biological samples provided, the probability of paternity is precisely 0%. The subject, currently known as Chase, is definitively and permanently excluded as the biological offspring of Derek Caldwell. The heavy words hit the still air like a physical shockwave. A deep, horrified gasp sounded from the far end of the table. Looking past Bradley, I saw 18-year-old Chase freeze completely, paralyzed in his leather chair. He dropped his smartphone onto the table, the color draining from his face and leaving his skin a sickly, translucent pale. Slowly turning his head, he stared at his mother with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging her to refute the impossible statement. Monica didn't even turn to look at her heartbroken son. Her arrogant, carefully constructed smile shattered into a mask of pure, absolute panic. The confident predator who had just ordered me to walk away was instantly replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her manicured hands hovering uselessly above the white envelope. She knew she was caught, yet her deceptive mind frantically tried to calculate an escape route from this inescapable, perfectly designed trap. Beside her, Bradley Jenkins felt the suffocating weight of his new reality. His smug smile vanished from his sweating face. Recognizing the undeniable presence of the federal agents, his financial knowledge told him exactly what was happening to his grand criminal scheme. Placing his sweaty hands flat on the table, he tried desperately to push his heavy chair back, instinctively wanting to flee the room or reach his private office to wipe the incriminating servers. Before he could even stand, halfway, one of the tall federal agents moved with terrifying speed. Stepping forward, the agent placed a massive, heavy hand firmly on Bradley's shoulder, forcing the corrupt CFO back into his leather chair. "Don't attempt to stand, sir," the agent ordered strictly, his voice a low, dangerous threat that signaled severe physical consequences if he dared disobey. Victor Long didn't bother looking at the struggling executive. He maintained his cold, steel-hard gaze, locked onto Monica. According to the strict, unyielding, and legally binding provisions established by the late Diane Caldwell, he explained smoothly, his powerful voice cutting through the rising panic, any lawful transfer of corporate assets, executive power, or financial holdings is strictly, exclusively, and permanently tied to verifiable direct biological descendants of the Caldwell bloodline. There are no exceptions, no hidden legal loopholes, and absolutely no alternative interpretations permitted. Victor leaned forward slightly over the edge of the table, ensuring his next words carried the full, inescapable weight of the law. Because you actively and maliciously engaged in a massive, systemic biological fraud designed to falsely present this young man as a legitimate blood heir. The emergency transfer and succession agreement on this table is null and void. The entire corporate transfer procedure is terminated immediately by law. You have no legal standing in this company. You hold no executive authority, and you have zero right to claim a single penny of the Caldwell fortune. As of this moment, you are completely stripped of all corporate and family authority. Victor's legal checkmate was absolute, flawless, and brilliantly unmerciful. The heavy silence that followed Victor's announcement was suffocating. Derek bolted out of his leather chair as if struck by electricity. A theatrical mask of anger covered his pale face, his voice cracking with artificial betrayal. How could you do this to me, Monica? He yelled frantically. You made me raise another man's son. You used me to steal from my own family. He desperately tried to convince the federal agents and me that he was entirely innocent of the grand deception. Turning to me with raised hands, he made a pathetic gesture of plea, fake tears welling in his cowardly eyes. I reached down and unclasped the heavy brass latches of my leather briefcase. I was far from finished with him. Pulling back the leather flap, the metallic snap echoed sharply through the room. Derek remained standing across from me, hands raised in a display of innocence. He closed his eyes tight, squeezing out miserable tears onto his pale cheeks, waiting for me to comfort him. Wait for his grieving father to rush forward and embrace his deceived son. I didn't move toward him. Instead, I reached deep into my briefcase and pulled out the heavy manila dossier Robert Sanchez had handed me at the diner. Extracting the highlighted document, the printed email from 10 years ago, I held the irrefutable digital record of his moral bankruptcy. Rather than simply handing it to him, I swung my arm and launched the crisp paper directly at his chest. It struck his designer suit and fluttered onto the polished table, landing right beside the incriminating lab report. "Don't you dare play the victim in front of me," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, raspy whisper that projected to every corner of the room. "You're a coward. You knew you were infertile. You've known for 10 long years, and you sold out your mother's sacred honor for a monthly allowance." Derek looked down at the highlighted paper lying on the wood. His fake tears stopped instantly, drying up like a turned-off tap. He recognized the bold black text and his own private email address at the top of the page. The last bit of color drained from his face, leaving his skin a dead, sickly gray. Victor Long, never one to waste a dramatic legal moment, leaned in and tapped a finger against the document. He read the most devastating sentences aloud for the entire executive board to hear, reciting Derek's own pathetic words that revealed how a childhood infection had left him infertile and how he actively conspired with Monica to deceive Diane just to secure his place in the trust. The sickening truth hung heavy in the air. Derek didn't attempt to deny it. He didn't scream that the document was forged. His knees gave out, and he collapsed back into his leather chair, the fight completely draining from his body. Burying his face in his trembling hands, he began to weep. Not the fake, manipulative crying from moments earlier, but the ugly, visceral sobbing of a man realizing his entire life had just been permanently destroyed. "Dad, please," he choked out through heavy sobs. "I was terrified. She made me do it. She told me Mom would cut me off entirely and leave me with nothing." He pointed a trembling finger at his wife, desperately trying to shift the blame. Monica turned and glared at him with pure, unvarnished disgust. "Don't you dare blame your pathetic cowardice on me," she screamed, her voice cracking with frantic panic. "You were more than happy to take the money. You happily lived in the mansion and drove the luxury cars. You're a weak, pathetic excuse for a man who couldn't even give me a child." Shifting her venomous gaze away from her weeping husband, she locked eyes with Bradley Jenkins, who was still held firmly in his chair by the tall federal agent. "This was supposed to be seamless, Bradley," she hissed, her styled hair falling wildly around her face. "You promised me the paper trail was completely covered. You promised me the old man would never look close enough to find the offshore routing numbers." Bradley snapped back at her, his smooth, arrogant facade completely shattered. Don't put this all on me, you greedy sociopath, he shouted over the chaos. You were the one demanding we speed up the timeline. You were the one pushing to drain the pension fund, while his wife was still dying in hospice because you couldn't wait to buy that property in the Palisades. The unholy alliance they had carefully built over 19 years quickly collapsed into a venomous screaming match. They were no longer the sophisticated corporate predators who had smugly planned my downfall days ago. They were cornered rats viciously tearing each other apart in a desperate, futile attempt to save themselves from a sinking ship. I leaned back in my chair, watching their self-destruction with absolute detachment. My heart was a cold, indestructible vault. Looking at their red, screaming faces, I recalled the ruthless freight wars of the 90s. Diane and I had faced brutal union strikes, aggressive corporate espionage, and massive predatory logistics conglomerates that tried to grind our young business into dust. We had survived countless sleepless nights, navigating dangerous financial waters, with nothing but pure grit and unwavering loyalty to each other. I had stared down armed hijackers trying to steal our cargo on dark, deserted interstates, fighting for every single dollar in our bank account. These weak, pampered vultures never stood a chance against a real predator. They thought corporate warfare was wearing expensive suits and forging digital signatures in air-conditioned executive offices. They severely underestimated the lethal resilience of a man who had bled to build the very foundation they stood on. The screaming in the boardroom reached a fever pitch. Derek sobbed uncontrollably into his hands. Monica hysterically tried to hurl a glass pitcher at Bradley, who was loudly demanding legal representation while cursing her name. The newly appointed board members, the ones Bradley had hired 2 days ago as compliant rubber stamps for their embezzlement scheme, sat frozen in total, stunned silence, watching their brief, lucrative careers evaporate before their eyes. 18-year-old Chase stared at the chaotic scene, his jaw hanging open. He was slowly realizing his entire identity, vast fortune, and family history were nothing more than a calculated illusion. I felt zero pity for any of them. Destroying their carefully crafted lies was a necessary purge. Looking toward the head of the conference table, I gave a simple nod. The federal agents stepped forward, their handcuffs glinting under the bright lights. Bradley Jenkins, Monica Caldwell, the lead agent announced, his authoritative voice instantly silencing the room. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and the criminal embezzlement of $4.5 million from the Caldwell Logistics Employee Pension Fund. You have the right to remain silent. The metallic click of the steel handcuffs, ratcheting shut, echoed through the boardroom with sharp finality. The sound cut through the lingering chaos, bringing a sudden, terrifying reality to the arrogant predators who had planned to destroy me. Monica didn't surrender quietly. As the federal agent secured her wrists behind her back, she began struggling violently. Her tailored suit wrinkled and twisted as her expensive heels kicked wildly against the thick carpet. Her composure was gone, replaced by the hysterical tantrum of a spoiled child stripped of her prize. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, her voice shrill. "I gave nearly 20 years to this family. I managed your pathetic son. I gave you the illusion of a perfect legacy. I deserve half of this. Company! You owe me, Richard! You owe me everything!" I watched her performance with steady, detached eyes. Ignoring her demands, the federal agents dragged her toward the double doors. Bradley Jenkins offered no physical resistance. The weight of the federal indictment had crushed whatever arrogance he possessed. Head hanging low, face pale, and silk tie askew, he walked out in humiliated silence. A defeated man who understood his fraud had just cost him his life. The mahogany doors closed, cutting off Monica's fading screams. The sudden absence of their voices left a suffocating quiet. The newly appointed board members quietly gathered their briefcases and hurried out through the side exits. I didn't bother stopping them. They were merely symptoms, and I was focused on removing the root cause. I slowly turned my gaze back to the head of the long table. Derek remained slumped in his chair, hands covering his face, shoulders trembling with quiet, pathetic sobs. He had watched his wife get dragged away and done nothing to protect her or himself. Reaching into my briefcase one last time, I pulled out a single legal document stamped with the official seal of Victor Long's law firm. I walked down the length of the polished table, the rhythmic clicking of my dress shoes echoing loudly in the empty space, stopping right beside Derek's chair. I didn't place a comforting hand on his shoulder. I dropped the paper onto his lap. Lowering his hands, Derek looked down at the document through tear-filled eyes. Reading the bold header, his breath hitched painfully. It was a legally binding eviction notice. You have exactly 24 hours to move all your belongings out of the house I bought for you, I stated, my voice completely devoid of paternal warmth. Leave the keys on the counter, and do not ever set foot on that property again. I cleared my throat. Furthermore, your employment at Caldwell Logistics is permanently terminated. You are stripped of your corporate title, your salary, and all associated benefits. Derek looked up, his wide eyes filled with desperate terror. Dad, please, he wailed, his trembling hands clasped tightly together. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to live? I have nothing left. You made your choice 10 years ago when you decided to sell out your mother's honor to protect a false inheritance, I answered, my tone firm and unyielding. You willingly participated in a deception because you were too weak to build a life of your own. Victor has already executed the legal amendments to the trust fund. You are completely and permanently disinherited. You will not receive a single dollar from my estate. You are fired, you are evicted, and as far as I'm concerned, you are nothing to me. Do not ever attempt to contact me again. Derek buried his face in his hands, weeping openly, broken by the severity of the punishment. I walked away, refusing to look at the wreckage of a man who had squandered every advantage he had ever been given. I turned my attention to the far end of the table. 18-year-old Chase still sat there, frozen in shock. He looked impossibly young, fragile, and completely lost. His vast inheritance and family history brutally stripped away. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking mix of fear and confusion. He was the product of a deception, but he was also an unwitting victim of their grand crime. I looked at the boy I had treated as my own blood for 18 years. I didn't hate him, but I couldn't look at him without connecting his existence to the 19 years of lies. He wasn't my blood, and he wasn't my legacy. Walking over, I stopped a few feet away from him. Listen closely, Chase, I said, keeping my voice firm, but softer than the tone I had used with Derek. You are not responsible for the crimes your mother and biological father committed. You didn't ask to be born into this deception. However, you are no longer part of the Caldwell family, and you are no longer entitled to the privileges that come with this name. You have to learn how to navigate the real world without a safety net. The boy nodded slowly, swallowing hard, overwhelmed by the harsh reality crashing down on him. "I won't leave you completely penniless on the street today," I continued, maintaining respectful boundaries. "I will pay for your first year of college tuition and basic living expenses in full for exactly 1 year. That gives you 12 months to find a part-time job, apply for student loans, and chart your own path forward. Use that time wisely to get on your feet, because after those 12 months expire, you are entirely on your own. Do you understand?" Chase nodded again, a single tear slipping down his pale cheek. "I understand, sir," he said quietly. "Thank you." I watched Chase stand up, his movements stiff and uncertain. Picking up his backpack, he walked silently out of the boardroom, leaving behind the vast fortune he had assumed was his birthright. Derek followed closely behind, stumbling blindly toward the exit without daring to utter a word of protest. A broken man stepping out into a harsh world he was entirely unprepared to face. The mahogany doors closed completely, sealing the massive room in deep silence. I stood alone at the head of the polished table. The morning's overwhelming chaos had evaporated, leaving a sharp, quiet tranquility. I looked around the broad room, the nerve center of the empire I had built with my own hands. Victor Long stepped quietly out from the shadows, his sleek black briefcase held firmly at his side. He approached me with slow, respectful steps. "It's over, Richard," Victor said softly, his voice a steady presence in the quiet room. "The malignancy has been surgically removed from your company." Taking a deep breath, I felt the suffocating weight of the past 19 years finally lift off my shoulders. "Yes, Victor, the cancer is finally gone," I replied, ready to face the future, my voice steady and resolute. "But this empire still needs to be rebuilt. 6 months have passed since the storm swept through the halls of Caldwell Logistics. The wheels of federal justice moved slowly, but they ultimately arrived with devastating certainty. I sat quietly in the heavy oak gallery of the federal courthouse, watching the final chapter of Monica and Bradley's arrogance come to a permanent conclusion. The presiding judge, a stern man with zero tolerance for corporate predators, delivered a scathing rebuke that echoed through the quiet courtroom. Monica and Bradley were both sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison for massive wire fraud and grand embezzlement. Monica didn't scream or struggle. This time, she froze completely. Her once flawless designer wardrobe was replaced by the harsh reality of a standard prison uniform. The luxurious life she had spent nearly 2 decades lying and manipulating to secure had vanished. Bradley stood beside her, a hollow shell of his former self, completely devoid of the smooth CFO persona he used to project. Handcuffed and lead out of the courtroom, they were permanently banished from the world they had tried to steal from me. My son, Derek, faced a different, yet equally crushing reality. Cut off from the Caldwell fortune and stripped of his lavish lifestyle, he experienced a harsh fall. I hired a private investigator to check on him just once, simply to ensure the eviction and disinheritance had been fully executed. The report was pathetic, yet fitting for a man who had sold his mother's honor for a comfortable allowance. Derek was living in a cramped, noisy apartment complex in a rundown part of the city. To make ends meet, he was working a grueling, minimum-wage retail job at a local home improvement store. Wearing a cheap polyester vest, he took orders from managers half his age, hauling heavy merchandise across the sales floor for a meager hourly wage. He was finally forced to learn the true value of an earned dollar. A lesson Diane and I had tried so hard to teach him decades ago. I felt zero pity for his current plight. He was simply harvesting the barren fruit of the deception he had willingly sown. While the architects of my downfall faced their new realities, I focused all my energy on repairing the damage done to my life's work. Rebuilding Caldwell Logistics was no easy task, but I approached it with the same relentless drive that allowed me to build the empire from a single rusty truck. My first executive action was to personally contact Thomas Sterling and the other loyal executives who had been fired during Monica's brief reign. I invited them back to corporate headquarters, offering them their original positions, substantial financial bonuses, and a sincere apology for the disruption. They returned without hesitation, seamlessly stepping back into their roles and helping me stabilize the company. Working alongside Agent Harrison and the federal investigation team, we traced every stolen dollar through the maze of offshore accounts. The process was tedious, but Victor Long's brilliant legal work ensured the frozen Cayman Islands accounts were repatriated. The $4.5 million siphoned off by Bradley and Monica was recovered in full. I personally supervised the transfer of those funds directly back into the employee pension account ensuring the hard-working men and women who formed the backbone of Caldwell Logistics didn't lose a single cent of their retirement security. On the morning the funds were fully restored, I called an all-company meeting. Sandy, standing before hundreds of dedicated employees, I assured them the storm had passed and their futures were secure. Looking at their relieved faces, I felt the heavy darkness of the past 6 months finally lift from my shoulders. The malignancy had been permanently removed, and the healing process was well underway. Yet, the complete reconstruction of my company required more than balancing financial ledgers and rehiring loyal staff. It required a structural change to the foundation of the Caldwell legacy. I needed to ensure the corporate greed that had poisoned my family could never again threaten the empire. Diane and I had sacrificed so much to build. On a crisp, clear Tuesday morning, I took the private elevator to the roof of the Caldwell Logistics headquarters. The rooftop offered a sweeping panorama of the sprawling city skyline below, a vibrant metropolis where my delivery trucks operated daily. The cold morning wind whipped against my custom suit jacket, but I felt a steady warmth radiating in my chest. Victor Long stood quietly beside me, holding a thick leather folder containing the finalized legal documents that would permanently reshape my fortune. Reaching out, I took the heavy gold pen he offered. Without hesitation, I placed the documents on a small glass table we had brought onto the roof and signed my name in smooth, decisive strokes. I officially executed a new unbreakable trust agreement. 50% of my personal wealth and company shares were immediately transferred into the newly established Diane Caldwell Scholarship Foundation. Designed to charitable initiative, a scholarship and living stipends, designed living stipends to underprivileged youth who possessed the drive to succeed. Youth, but lacked the financial resources. Diane had always believed in the transformative power of education and hard work. This foundation would immortalize her memory, ensuring her name remained associated with generosity rather than greed. The remaining 50% of company shares were irrevocably placed into an employee stock ownership plan. The wealth of Caldwell Logistics would not pass to an entitled, ungrateful heir. It would be systematically distributed among the dedicated truck drivers, warehouse managers, and loyal executives who bled and sweated to build this company alongside me. They were the churve to share in its my empire, and they deserved to share in its rewards. Standing at the edge of the roof, looking out over the endless city, I knew family wasn't defined by blood, and it certainly wasn't defined by a marriage certificate. It was defined by unwavering loyalty. An old wolf might lose his mate, but he never loses his teeth. And I had just bitten back,